Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is Dr. David Reedman. I am the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database, and I write the weekly School Shooting Data Analysis and Reports Substack. Kids face, a lot of dangers within the school building that we talk about. That's pretty much the topic of every one of these shows. How do you prevent school shootings? How do you increase school security? What are the proactive things that you can do to identify somebody on a pathway to violence? But we don't do a lot of research about is what happens right when kids leave the door to the school and what happens in the half hour or 2 hours after they've left the school. Because firearms are the leading cause of death and injury for children, anyone under 17 across the country. So we need to understand the characteristics of all of the different ways and reasons that kids are being shot. So today I have the two perfect guests to talk about this, the authors of a new paper, After School Child Firearm Assaults, a quasi-experimental analysis. And I have two of the authors of that paper here today, Emma Gause and Dr. Jonathan J. Emma is a research scientist at Boston University, and Dr. John is an associate professor at Boston University School of Public Health. Both of you, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good to be here.
And before we get started, you are two of the 7 authors on this paper. So I want to give you an opportunity to acknowledge the other 5 and explain to our listeners why some of these academic papers have so many names listed at the top of them.
I'll take a shot at that. So this is part of a long-running collaboration that we have with Dr. Sonali Rajan at Columbia. And so she's an expert on child firearm injuries. We worked with her and Don Myers, who's a PhD student there. Chris Rick was part of a broader collaboration with BU, and he here was an expert on school schedules. Dr. Maria Gleamore and Suzanne McClone. Maria is the chair of epidemiology at BU School of Public Health, and Suzanne is a PhD student here. And so they were coming in, both sort of working on the data and the methods to help us do this in a way, just as many perspectives as possible to do this in the most rigorous way possible.
Yeah, this paper is looking at a very small subset of an already understudied subset of firearm violence, which is that associated with kind of the school schedule. What brought you to the idea for this study to look at comparing the school day rate to your after school rate of child firearm assaults?
There's a few things that brought us to this. Part of it is just wanting to understand key drivers of child firearm assaults. We are coming to this with more of a background in community violence. So sort of everything that happens outside of the school, and especially this form of violence that is sort of happens primarily in public spaces, outside of families, but is the single most common cause of gun assaults, both for adults and for children. At the same time, school is just such a big part for school-age kids. School has such a big effect on daily, where you go, what you do. You spend so much of your time there. And so we have been interested in this interface between school environments and community environments, school schedules, and what's happening outside of the school. And, I think we especially sort of want to see where there might be opportunities for intervention. So even if sort of shootings aren't happening in schools, if it's happening just after school, schools have infrastructure. They sort of we know where kids are starting this period. And so between school resources and community resources, there may be a chance to really improve safety during these key hours.
A frequent question that I get is, what's the difference between a school shooting and a mass shooting? And I think your point there is really important about the school is the community for children and teenagers. So adult mass shooters target workplaces, target their spouse's workplace, target the bar that they frequented, whatever place represents their grievance. And for an adult, that can be all of these different places that adults interact with in society. For school shooters, this is your deliberately planned attacks. The school essentially is their entire community. It's the only place, it's the only opportunity for them to attack. Now, that's the deliberately planned attacks, but this paper is more about the systemic gun violence, which is something that we've also talked about a lot of the show. That's the fights that escalate into shootings, the shooting during a robbery, the shooting during a drug deal, the accidents that happen, the suicides that happen. And what's interesting is, well, the school day might be the target for a deliberately planned attack. From your paper, it's the structure of the school day actually decreases the rate of a lot of that systemic gun violence that then you see in other periods. How did you go about kind of putting together your data and starting to figure out how you were going to distinguish between kind of the school day and the after school and the evidence that would start supporting your research question?
Yeah, I can jump in. So we had a data set from the New York City Police Department on all pediatric shootings in New York City for our study period, which started in the 2006-2007 school year and went through the 2022-2023 school year. So we know where and when and on what day every single reported child firearm assault occurred in the city. And based on the criminology literature, previous literature that talked about sort of safety in the after school period, often researchers have used 2 p.m. to sort of distinguish between school day or daytime period, and then the 2 p.m. starts the beginning of the after school period. We also had some data in more recent years about specific New York City school schedules. So we could look at what were the actual dismissal times for high schools in New York City. We found that those were around 2:30 to 3:15, changing throughout the year and obviously different from school to school. But we looked both at 2 p.m., which is that sort of previous traditional dichotomy between the school and after school period, and then also in a data-driven approach at school dismissal times, and investigated both of those transitions. There was, some evidence from recent news and pediatric shootings in other cities that suggests that kids are leaving school earlier than dismissal time, and not any evidence of sort of skipping school, like maybe they've gotten an early dismissal if they have a free period at the end of the day. So we wanted to make sure, particularly because firearm injuries are most likely in sort of that older range of the pediatric age range, that we were taking into account sort of special schedules of high schoolers.
And that data set led you to decide to do a quasi-experimental analysis. What does quasi-experimental mean?
Yeah, I love talking about this. As an epidemiologist, I'll get on my sort of professor box, but the gold standard in epidemiology for doing an experiment or assessing evidence is sort of a randomized control trial, where you randomize everything and then you change one thing and you see between the group that had the intervention versus not, whether it was effective. But in studies of injury prevention, firearm injury, and many others, it's not okay to randomize people into unsafe conditions. We would never do that. And so a quasi-experimental study essentially tries to replicate the conditions of a randomized control trial, but using the data that exists. So whatever group people fall into is the groups that you compare against each other. But there's a couple of other considerations to make sure it's robust and you're comparing apples to apples in a way that makes your evidence stronger to interpret.
And with that interpretation and analysis, there are some different statistical tools that you used to create these findings from the data. What were those tools like? Why did you select them? And then most importantly, what makes them valid to people that think, oh, well, these are stats. You can just cut them up however you want. What's the robustness of these findings?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that with any investigation, analysis, statistical analysis that you conduct, one of the most important things you can do is have a hypothesis that you're testing and have that hypothesis backed up by previous research, theory that supports the question that you're asking. And so that's the most important thing. You have sort of a plausible question that you want to answer based on other things that you know. And then you use statistical tools that are appropriate for that to be, to test that a priori hypothesis. And a priori here just means that you've thought of it before, it's specified, pre-specified. And then you can use sort of more robust methods to make sure that you're treating the data in a robust way. So we used two different approaches that are similar, compare a pre-period and a post-period, but answer slightly different questions. And both of them are sort of in the realm of considered sort of causal inference methods if they're applied correctly. And causal inference means we can sort of start to say that maybe your exposure causes the outcome. They're not just correlated, but that there's a strong connection that you can start drawing that inference from. So we're always very cautious to interpret things causally, but these are sort of considered some of the most robust methods that you could use in this situation. The first is a difference in difference analysis, and it essentially compares the after school period to the school day period on school days versus the after school period to the school day period on non-school days. So our hypothesis is that transition to after school would only increase firearm injury risk on school days when kids are in school and transitioning to the after school period. On non-school days, there may be higher risk in the afternoons just for other reasons, but it's obviously not related to school. And then the second, the DID, difference in difference analysis, looks at sort of the entire after school period. Is it in the 4 hours after school, is risk higher compared to the previous school day? And is it more than we would expect on a non-school day? The second approach was an RDD, or a regression discontinuity design. And that design is specifically meant to test immediately at the after school transition. So immediately at that 2 p.m. transition, or the enrollment-weighted dismissal time that we used in the sensitivity analysis, is there a jump? So is there an immediate effect of children leaving school? So the differentiation between those two approaches: in the first, we're looking at in the entire after school period, is injury risk higher for children? And in the second, that RDD, we're looking immediately at 2 p.m. Does risk jump? Does it increase immediately?
So this became a quasi-experiment because you were able to take your data set and from that data set create distinct groups within it. And then you were able to make a comparison between that before school dismissal and the after school dismissal. And that would be your quasi experiment. Whereas like if this were a true experiment, it would be one set of mice gets this food, the other set of mice gets this other food, and then we measure their outcome over time. Since you can't do that we can't turn little kids in the school into mice, you were able to split and divide and compare your data with some statistical measures to then develop those kind of experimental results, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, using the real data that we had and simulating as close as possible the conditions of an experiment.
You did make a point in there about correlation versus causation, and I think that those are terms that frequently get used incorrectly or get used interchangeably. Can you just break down quickly what correlation means versus what causation means, and why a lot of papers are not giving you kind of both?
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen on the internet, there's all sorts of funny correlation findings where like cheese sales and divorce rates are correlated, or Nick Cage movies and I don't know, something else. And you can see like these data really, really track closely together. And if you didn't know what they were, you would say, oh, wow, those things are really related. That's correlation. Data is similar, to each other. We find patterns across the two that seem to be alike. This can be an early indication that potentially one causes the other or vice versa. But it is sort of an early indication of an association. These two things are related, but we might not know necessarily why. In a causal inference or a causal investigation is sort of what you're interested in is A causes B. Your exposure causes the disease. And that's much harder to study. Even with sort of advanced methods, it's difficult to say with certainty. And I think as researchers, we're very, very cautious in using that causal language. So it's the gold star and what we're all striving for, but it's difficult to do. And it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think of what we're interested in here was the causal question of whether kids leaving school or kids being let out of school increases their risk. Like it has the effect of increasing their risk of getting shot. And so all of these quasi-experimental methods are meant to see, well, we see even if we see a correlation with between the after-school period and shootings, well, is it just because people get shot in the afternoon more than they get shot at midday? So that's why we sort of test school days versus non-school days. It's like, look, we would expect, if there's a causal association, we'd expect to see a much stronger association, much stronger correlation on school days, not non-school days. And then the regression discontinuity design, like it's really I think it's a very beautiful design. It was one that, as a graduate student, made me fall in love with these kinds of methods, was to see like, well, if school lets out, or if kids start leaving around 2 p.m., and we see a big jump in risk between 159 to 201, or, 155 to 205, like what happened in there? Like, if nothing else, if the only thing that's happened in this neighborhood that changed for these kids or in this neighborhood between 155 and 205 is that school let out, this isn't absolutely final answer conclusive, but it's by far the most plausible explanation is that it was that change in the school schedule that caused that difference in risk.
Well, that's a good segue into your findings. So could you kind of explain what this analysis of 2,485 child firearm assault injuries in New York City during your period showed once you were able to apply your statistical measures to test that hypothesis that the dismissal time is this key factor in influencing that firearm injury rate?
Yeah, I can talk about the exact results, and then John, maybe you can jump in with some of the discussion interpretation. But essentially, we found that in the difference in difference analysis that it was assessing the change in risk on school days compared to non-school days into the after-school period, we found that the risk of child firearm injuries increased by approximately 45% after that 2 p.m. threshold on school days compared to non-school days. And the finding was not statistically significant because there was some power issues, but essentially, the two ways that we evaluate a finding is the strength of the association, so how large it is, and then this statistical significance, which is based on sample size and other things. So it's sort of a substantial increase in risk, 45% increase in risk in the after-school period on school days. And so that's pretty indicative of it's not just that firearm injury risk on children increases throughout the day on school days and on non-school days, which we do see. It's that increase on school days is markedly higher than the increase in the same hours on non-school days. And then in the RDD, the regression discontinuity design analysis, we found that directly at 2 p.m., there is an increase, a significant increase of approximately like 2.6 additional pediatric firearm shootings directly at that 2 p.m. threshold. And to put that number 2.6 in context, the average number of pediatric shootings in the school day, the 4 hours before 2 p.m., is about 0.9 per hour. So that increase, that significant increase of 2.6 additional child firearm assault injuries at 2 p.m. is about a 280% increase compared to that school day average. So there's a significant jump in pediatric firearm assault risk directly at 2 p.m. And a couple of the sensitivity analyses we used with different thresholds for defining when after school started, we found consistently positive results, which means an increased risk wherever you say the 2 p.m. or the after school threshold is. There's an increase in injury risk, and it differed a little bit in the magnitude, but this is sort of conclusive evidence that when children leave school, there is an increased risk of firearm assault among children.
And I'll just jump in that it sort of reinforces the idea that school, at the population level, school is a comparatively safe place versus the community, at least during these after school, less supervised hours. And then in particular, that sort of on school days, this period requires intervention. So we have colleagues who work on programs like Safe Passage. That's a way of stationing adult monitors along the paths that kids use to walk to and from school or to and from transit. And there's other approaches that could be used in a strategic way to try and reduce risk during those hours. Sort of a key one being potentially increasing time in structured activities, whether that's at school or after school programs or other after school type activities. In general, there is less capacity than there is demand for after school activities. So investments in that area is, I think, one of the key implications of the study.
Yeah, this fit with one of the findings from looking at the data I collect for gunfire on school property is when it's coded by the time periods of the school day: arrival, morning classes, lunch, afternoon classes, dismissal, after school, evening, sporting events, and so on. Dismissal is the highest category, and it consistently has been back to the 1960s. And within those incidents, most of them are fights that escalate into a shooting. And during a fight, oftentimes the kid with the gun isn't really targeting somebody specifically. They just start shooting amid the fight. And then bystander students who just happen to be outside of the school at dismissal, because that's where students are at dismissal, end up getting shot. And within your data, I thought it was very interesting that the shootings on school days have roughly double the number of female victims as the shootings on non-school days. So many of those fights at dismissal, it ends up being a bystander female student who's just there leaving school when the shooting occurs, and they end up getting shot. But based on this data, when it's a non-school day, those girls don't seem to be in the places where they'd end up being a bystander. So there's a lot of layers within this analysis that have all of these kind of conflicting findings as well. Like, girls are safer when they don't end up in a circumstance where they're going to be potentially exposed to being a bystander victim of young boys who are involved in a shooting. But at the same time, it's very important for everybody to be in school.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I mean, I think the school has this unique characteristic of it's something that, the vast majority of kids on any given day have to make their way from home to school and back. And, we do, they're in the literature and things that we hear. It's like there are kids are sometimes staying home to stay safe. Sometimes there's strategies that young people adopt in order to try and stay safe on trips to and from school. You mentioned sort of like a kid who had a gun, maybe they're carrying that gun because they feel unsafe leaving school, getting home. And so it's this is the kind of thing that we're really concerned with in public health is, obviously the solution is not to cancel school, But given what we know about sort of population activity patterns, we need to meet this demand with resources.
And so, speaking to those resources, when within your school day data, there are peaks around immediately at dismissal, around 5 p.m., 7 p.m., 9 p.m., and then it dips off because, children and teens on a school night are, going to sleep because they have to be up early the next morning. What types of kind of community interventions or public health or social service type strategies could be applied to the afternoon to kind of mitigate some of these high risk times?
So I mentioned safe passage, which is very focused on those sort of arrival time, dismissal time, and specific places. So, let's say 5-block radius around the school where, at least when you're talking about that cluster of young people who are leaving school around the same time, there could be some adult supervision. In general, when we talk about sort of community violence, we're often thinking about interventions like a category called community violence intervention. So that's where people who have relevant lived experience are tasked with sort of connecting with the people at the highest risk of being involved in violence, right? And sort of in a given school, I think probably the staff know or probably should know who are the young people who might be most likely to have brought a gun or might be most likely to be in a fight that escalates after school. And so some of our partners, for example, in Toledo, Ohio, they have school-based interrupters. And the job of that school-based interrupter is to get to know students, connect with them in a way that feels authentic, maybe because that young person himself, the interrupter himself or herself, has been exposed to violence or has been a driver of violence in the past. And they can mediate disputes. They can also sort of help people change their thinking and their behaviors over time.
And I think this fits with some other research that we've discussed on this podcast about gun violence on the walkable routes to and from school. And I'll put a link in the show notes. But there was a study in the south side of Chicago of firearm violence in the before school and the after school period and mapping it along the most common walking routes that students had to and from school. And the findings were significant that the implementation of a safe passage route had a significant decrease compared to a control group where there were shootings occurring along that walking route. So I think there's a growing body of empirical evidence that some pretty low cost things like having community volunteers that are going to be out at crosswalks and sidewalks and so on for, that short period of time, only a half hour to an hour, can have a pretty significant impact on violence disruption. And that fits with routine activities theory, which is a criminological theory back to the 70s, that having the presence of a capable guardian, which is just somebody who's watching in some sort of authority figure, and that could be a mall cop, that could be a person in a vest, it could be a police officer, just the presence of that capable guardian changes the rate of crime that occurs in their immediate vicinity.
Absolutely. And in Chicago, they have walkie-talkies and vests, and there's good evidence that violence on those routes at those times is reduced.
Still an enormous problem. What shocked me in that Chicago paper is people, I think, don't realize the scope of peripheral gun violence around schools, because the paper found that in any given year, between 40 and 62% of schools in Chicago had a shooting within 400 meters of the school, either in that time period before or after school. So we put enormous amounts of resources into keeping kids safe between the bells. But as soon as the bell rings and they're out, as you found and as some other research has found, there's a significant risk that's not being addressed.
And just outside. Yeah.
What are the other kind of policy implications that you see from from this peak period, and especially the difference between a school day versus a non-school day?
Let me just mention, sort of, because it popped into my head, was those exposures. There's really interesting research from Baltimore showing that kids whose routes to school involved being on foot past the location where either gun violence or a serious assault had happened, their attendance was lower. And that in that study, the comparison group includes kids who ride the train past a location like that, or specifically the vulnerability of having to be on foot, either walking to school or walking to transit. One of the effects of that kind of exposure is that kids end up missing school. So just thinking about sort of the range of outcomes, like this is showing up at school in terms of absenteeism. We also know that it affects test scores. So this is, I think there's so much reason to attend to these kinds of problems.
From a physical security standpoint, I think that these findings around dismissal are also important because a lot of schools have fenced the entire campus, and then you have a single gate kind of in and out of the school. And I've seen some cases of shootings that occur on the street 1 or 2 blocks from the school, where the student has to walk multiple blocks to go down the fenced sidewalks until they're able to reach the gate. If that fence didn't exist and they just cut across a field or cut directly to the school, or you didn't have everybody crowded in the same area at arrival and dismissal, then you might, through kind of natural design, mitigate away that circumstance where either a kid is on an exposed walkable route for a longer period of time than they need to be, or you're artificially creating a large congested congregation point with a single door. Unfortunately, those things are very difficult to kind of test and quantify at scale. But what types of kind of data and information would you need to take your findings and start applying them to kind of tangible strategies that you could test and see the impacts of?
Well, I think you gave a great example of a policy that it sounds like it's being implemented from the standpoint of sort of security within the school, right? Like we can keep things safer inside the school if we know exactly where everyone's entering from. But this is a study along with lots of other research, would point to the idea that if your primary concern is kids getting shot or exposed to violence, that's more likely to happen just outside of school. So, we're never going to have enough data to test that specific, sort of entry point issue. I don't think. I mean, there's Sonali and colleagues have looked at sort of physical structures around schools and how it affects shooting outcomes. But as a general point, I think you're right that when we see that there's this spike in victimization right around the time when kids are leaving, we might want to think about staggered dismissal. I mean, staggered dismissal times is common. So staggered dismissal times sort of reduces that big clumping, clustering effect. And I think sort of what you just suggested, the sort of physical equivalent, which is, more multiple, more permeable exit routes could have a similar effect.
Based on your work in this paper, what do you think are the unanswered questions that you have? And is this something that is going to be a topic that you are either already working on or plan to work on for some continued research about this time period and this finding?
Yeah, we have some. I'll let Emma start.
I'm sure you could say it more eloquently than I could, but I was just going to say that we kind of know that injury risk is highest in the afternoons. This study, I think, sort of proves that it is specific to an after-school context. So injury risk increases throughout the day on school days and non-school days, but that specific context of children all leaving school at the same time increases pediatric firearm assault risk in a way that is meaningful. And so now that we know this, or we have evidence to sort of back up what we thought we already knew about it, the most interesting thing is sort of how do we change it? How do we address it? What interventions would be successful in reducing risk in this particular high risk period? And I also want to note that, the highest rates of pediatric injury, firearm assault risk are not in the after school periods. They're like very, very late at night or early in the morning hours, typically on non-school days, weekends, and things like that. But the after school context is such a sort of environment or period that's ripe for intervention. We all know children are leaving school. We know where they start, as John mentioned earlier. And these are hours that, there are other things going on that could be leveraged to, promote safety in a way that is addressable. And I think the next steps in our research, and hopefully others as well, is sort of moving from the proving the point to the what interventions can we test and implement that will actually reduce the risk. So I think that is the next directions that would be most interesting to develop. And as John mentioned, we have some hypotheses about what that could be, whether it's safe routes to school, after school programming, even sort of improving built environment features, greening vacant lots, talking about the risk around liquor stores or whatever on kids' routes home from school. So improving the environment socially and physically around schools to help make them safer spaces.
Yeah, I definitely see this study as kind of a starting point from our standpoint. And I mean, by the way, I think there's criminologists who will see this study and say, like, this question was answered 20 years ago about after school is a time when kids are involved in bad stuff. Like, they're less supervised, kids get arrested more. But what we found here specifically, and this is, I think, more of a public health approach, was to look specifically at victimization. So there were questions here about, it's like, yeah, sure, we do know that kids are more likely to get arrested after school than during school. But in terms of getting shot, that was not obvious because, there's many fewer adults in the community potentially pulling the trigger between 2 to 6 p.m. than other times. And so we might not have seen such a big increase here, but we did. And so I think going forward in this area, as Emma said, we're interested in getting closer to the individual level. In general, what proportion of kids are staying at school for another 2 hours for some activity? What proportion are going straight home by walking? What proportion are getting picked up? All of which will point to which interventions might make the biggest difference. And I think sort of for all of the work that we put into the data set here, like, it was a huge effort to get sort of aligned all of the school schedules, lined up with the shootings data and school day, but sort of school days, school day hours, sort of all of that together. One thing that we were missing here was the connection between the shooting victim and a school. So we knew that a child got shot, but we didn't know which school they attended. We didn't know where they're coming from. And so I think the more we can zoom in on those links in future work, the better we'll be able to sort of connect the dots around specific interventions.
And from what I've seen, in the school shooting data as well, is that a number of those dismissal shootings involve non-students who are student age. So they've either dropped out or been suspended or expelled, but they're going to be right at the perimeter of the campus or even on the campus at dismissal. Because once everybody's leaving, that's the time. And if they were suspended for a fight that they had with another student, and they know that at 2:02, that student is coming out of this one door from the campus, that is the opportunity for a fight or a shooting to occur based on that structure and standardization of the school day.
Absolutely. So I think, and there's those specific connections, like someone who has a link to this school, but was not at school was waiting for someone in particular. And then there's also cases like, we read about, there's a terrible case in Philadelphia where some students were, had left school, gone to a bus stop like a couple of blocks away, and someone drives by, apparently a targeted shooting, I think, at a bus, but, whether, I don't know if they hit the bus, but they spray the bus stop with bullets. And, these students who were at the bus stop trying to get home or to their jobs or sort of wherever they're going get hit. So I think all of those we really want to understand, like, what's the most prevalent scenario here? How much does it have to do with that social proximity to school versus just geographical proximity? Or is it just about sort of being out in communities, especially communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence?
Yeah, for folks, who live in the suburbs or rural areas, they don't realize that in dense urban areas, they're not yellow school buses in most cases. Kids take public transit, public buses and public trains to school. And that Philly shooting you're talking about was, a dismissal shooting at the bus stop a block from the school, because that is where crowds of students are waiting to get on a city bus to drive them back to school. It's also interesting, and this is a little different from the focus of your paper, but how kind of exclusionary discipline and either failing out or suspending or expelling a student doesn't stop that teenager from still being around your school and interacting with some students. So one of the cases that has stood out to me as one of the most ridiculous ones I've ever looked at is there's a planned fight on the campus near the end of the school day that 2 students are involved in. There's a third student who had been expelled from the school, so he's on the other side of the chain link fence to watch the fight. And when his friend starts losing, he tosses a gun over the fence to his friend. That friend shoots the other kid. The other kid manages to take the gun away and shoot kid number 1. And now you have 2 different kids that are who shot each other amid a crowd of students. And the shooting was facilitated by a kid who was a student but has now been expelled. And this all happens within your supposed secure school perimeter. So we have all of these things that happen in association with the school day in areas and spaces and times that are not supervised by adults. And it sounds like a theme from your paper is that some additional supervision, some additional randomization, some additional time that kids are staying within structured activities are all things that have almost no cost, but could significantly change this high risk period that you identified.
I think that's really important. Yeah, the idea that to shrink that window and to do it with interventions that, it's not even the primary objective of an after school program or, like a work, youth employment program. It's like, it's not the only goal. It's like, these are enriching activities that are good for young people in all kinds of ways. And so I think, what we're seeing now is the flip side of that, like disinvestment in young people. One of the ways that plays out in terms of violence and sort of puts them at greater risk is because it leaves them exposed for longer, for more of their day. But I think also for those, the planned fights where there's a crowd of kids gathered around because everyone was talking about it that day and sort of everyone knew it was going to happen. I think that's part of the case for school-based interrupters is that, they will hear things that other adults in the school don't hear, and they know how to respond. They have training in ways to respond and in ways that sort of can maintain the trust of the kids who are at the highest risk. And so I think, that feels to me like a case where there's a lot that we can learn from all of the innovation that's happening in the community violence intervention space that, sort of is currently pretty separate from the school safety space. I think there's a lot going on in CVI that could be translated to schools.
Yeah, we even see in the data that the proportion of perpetrators, the age of the perpetrator, which I should make a caveat here that that is often missing if the perpetrator is not known and not, caught. We don't know who they were potentially, or at least the police don't know. And so, but when that data is recorded, there is a higher proportion of sort of pediatric perpetrators on school days compared to non-school days. But still the majority of perpetrators on both days are adults. So there's certainly, I think, something that things are starting in school and escalating outside of the school space and in more unstructured spaces and times. But there's also something about the community, just safety in the community for children who are leaving school that may have nothing to do with them and they're caught in an unsafe space. So both of those things obviously have different intervention targets. The school-based interrupters, absolutely essential. As we mentioned, we work with the city of Toledo, and they're doing great work. But then also sort of intervening on those unsafe community spaces, which might have nothing to do with school, but happen directly outside the school environment, are sort of two different but intertwined ways of addressing this.
Yeah, and that's a great point where a lot of people don't realize how many of these cases you never identify the perpetrator. So across all of the 3,300 shootings on school property that I've studied, in about half of them, the perpetrator is never identified. But when you look at the characteristics of it, if it's a fight at dismissal and a bunch of people are wearing hoodies and nobody can tell who the person who fired shots, was, there's a very, very high chance that that was a student or somebody directly associated with the school. So if you add that 50% unknown and say, there's a pretty good chance that these were, student or teenage kids who either suspended, expelled, or dropped out, then all of a sudden that's like 65 or 70% of the shootings are these teenage or adolescent perpetrators. And it seems like there's probably some really simple, creative things that you could do too. Like if a school buys, a dozen Xboxes and, just has a reason that keeps 100 kids in the school for a couple hours longer in the evening, you're decreasing their period of time during some of those peak areas because you're just giving them a place to hang out in a safe kind of monitored space. For my kind of final question here, one of the listeners of this show who will remain nameless is in the process of starting a radically different type of K through 12 school in conjunction with a major research university. If you were going to make a recommendation about how to change the structure of the school day and the school environment and kind of even the time period of your K through 12 school day based on these findings, what would that be? Like, how would you implement that in a totally new structure?
Let me start by saying we have some hesitation about sort of drawing conclusions about changing the school day, in part because I think one clear conclusion is that if you shrunk the after-school period, it likely would reduce a bunch of shootings that are just happening during unsupervised time. And so I think that, combined with the fact that kids just need things to do, is a reason to invest in time supervised and well spent in the afternoon, whether that's, didactic activities or organized sort of enrichment. We don't know for sure. I think kids have to leave school eventually. And it might be that having that time happen at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. when there's more community violence, because as Emma said, shooters are often adults. And it's like, if those people are more active or sort of more likely to be having disputes at 7 p.m., you might actually see a bigger kind of post-dismissal bump around those times. So I think that's where you might start to think about, assuming this is a school that's in a community that is impacted by violence, those staggered dismissal times, maybe sort of thinking about really carefully about safe passage and ways like safe routes for kids to get home. Even this is such a epidemiologist answer, but for a school to be collecting data from students about how they get home and where they feel safe and unsafe, like what the issues are, that's something that I think understandably school districts might feel hesitant to learn about stuff that is beyond their walls if they feel like they can't intervene. But it's like they can't turn a blind eye to this issue because it's showing up in the school in all kinds of ways, right? Kids' educational performance, attendance, probably the violence that they bring into school or don't. Like everything that happens in those after school hours or on those routes home is showing up in the school too. So I think for schools to potentially collect data and also to partner with community organizations to address hey, if you ask 10 kids, 7 of them mention this intersection that's 3 blocks away where the traffic is unsafe and they know somebody got killed there last year and everyone's avoiding that. And as a result, these kids miss the bus. These kids are late to school in the morning because they won't walk past there. And, there's just all understanding these consequences and like dealing with this head on, I think is the only way that we have a chance of dealing with it, given how complex all of these issues are.
Yeah, I might just add, wholeheartedly agree and second everything that John said. And then also, I've been thinking quite a bit recently that there's very few spaces that children can go that they're welcome and they don't have to pay money, and they can just be there in a structured or enriching time. Libraries are sort of one of the few places now that kids can just be. And so providing safe spaces, whether that's after school programs, community centers, work, youth work programs that provide sort of a safe, enriching space to be that is also a place that kids want to be, is really important. And then how they get between those places in a safe way.
Well, those are great points. I think it's really important that school administrators realize that it's not just their campus, it's the entire period before and after school, because every parent, every school administrator wants to give kids the safest environment possible. And we need to realize that that is a much bigger circle than just the physical property line of the campus. So the paper is After School Child Firearm Assaults, a Quasi-Experimental Analysis. There's a link to it in the show notes. And Dr. John and Emma, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.